Hello and welcome to Drugs and Behavior with Dr. Goodin. Thank you for coming or sitting on your bed and watching this, whatever you're doing. Thank you. So before I change slides, I'm going to give you a little introduction um, to this course especially. I've just finished reading the book to make sure I know what you're having to read. And so the deal is this. The book is dense. The book is full of facts, tons and tons of information, and so is my discussion as I go through it. One thing I will try to do is to weave together the important points to make it into a story somewhat. Um, Hopefully I do a decent job at that. As you're listening, um, you're going to need to focus, and you're going to need to find a way, think ahead, plan ahead for the way you want to focus. Um, what I suggest is this. Every drug mentioned, you may have to look in the book, but every drug mentioned, you are going to want to write down, type out some way. You're going to want to make notes. You're going to want to mention the drug as you write it down, and then find a way for saying all the important things, noting all the important things about each drug, the prevalence, very short history, um, why it's used, what are its effects, what are its acute effects, what are its chronic or long-term effects, um, whether it causes dependence, what withdrawal is like from it, um, how the legal system and society view it, and of course toxicity. So think about those things in the list. You may alter your list as you go through, but think about the things. And there may be drugs that you write down and you realize, hey, Joel didn't talk a lot about this. So just put an X through it, or just put a really small note. Because of course the things I talk about the most are the things that are more likely to be on a test. Um, Speaking of tests, I will um, I will ask that you trust me to come back and sort of point you in the right directions of what to study specifically. Um, Most of my classes, I really hate to have students memorize. There may be some stuff in this chapter, however, that I really want you to sort of put to memory. Um, just some factoids. I don't expect you to memorize all of it, but there will be some things that I may ask you to understand general concepts and memorize. Um, Not like so that you can write it out exactly, but memorize to the point that you won't forget in a few years. You'll kind of be like, oh yeah, I remember um, X or Y, right? You'll understand these things. So without further ado, I will continue. This is chapter 1. It's called Drugs, Behavior, and Modern Society. Drugs and Behavior Today. Alright, so drugs are everywhere. Um, so drug problems are also. So there's a picture of our president in 2014. Um, and he is a cigarette smoker. Um, and so we'll look at some introductory topics. Regular consumption of alcohol often begins in junior high school or even earlier. There are 80,000 deaths each year attributed to excessive drinking. Binge drinking is a major problem on college campuses that contributes to rape and violent behaviors, not to mention deaths from uh, alcohol toxicity. 10% of high school seniors smoke cigarettes, which is less than half of what it was in the 90s. So it seems like things are getting better. Um, Prescription drug abuse is an epidemic. It's a big deal. In New York State, prescriptions for pain medication rose, listen to this, it rose from 82%, rose by 82%, sorry, from 2007 to 2010. So in 3 to 4 years, it rose 82%. Unintentional drug poisoning causes as many injuries and deaths among 25 to 64-year-olds as motor vehicle accidents. So we have a choice in life to use or not use drugs, legal or not, of course, right? And I want you to view a lot of things, especially psychological topics, as choices. And that's pretty much the way I live my life. And if you view that as the way people and yourself can view your own life, I think it's a good way to look at things as a choice. Well, you made your choice, and a lot of people make the choice even though they know it has harmful consequences. It's a cost-benefit analysis, and I know this is going to hurt later, but I really want to get high right now. Things like that. We make these choices. Okay, so there's a hot political issue with marijuana legalization in some states, actually throughout the nation. And we get mixed messages from our social environment regarding drug-taking behavior. With advertising, it is censored to some extent for alcohol and cigarettes. Still, 1 in 4 Americans are current cigarette smokers. Beer commercials are entertaining. They promote a happy lifestyle, despite the tagline they always put, to drink responsibly. My question to you is, do we even hear those messages of caution? And by hear, I mean think about, right? Of course, major political figures have admitted smoking marijuana, but the federal government still considers it illegal, with a high potential for abuse and no federally accepted medical use. Currently, it's still in the same category as heroin. This is a little mistake I've made, so I just want you to be careful as you're typing this. There's a difference between the word heroin and heroin, spelled with an E versus not. Okay? One is a female who is a hero, that's with an E, and heroin without an E is a drug. Okay? So just gonna help you keep those two separate. So there are anti-drug campaigns that you've probably been in schools and the media featuring celebrities or sports stars. Often those same people abuse the same drugs. Um, so there are two ways of looking at drugs and behavior. The first is biological, psychological, and sociological effects of consuming certain types of drugs. We call this the biopsychosocial model. The second is a focus on the complex interplay of circumstances in our lives that lead to drug-taking behavior. All right, and here is a short sort of recap of the biopsychosocial model. I encourage you to just read through it. Okay. Psychoactive drugs have the ability to alter the functioning of the brain to produce changes in our behavior and experience. Of course, there are criminal penalties for illegal drugs, which are also called illicit drugs. However, there are legal or licit drugs that are also psychoactive substances like alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, and prescription medications. Things like vitamin C are not considered drugs. If they are naturally produced in the body, they are most likely not considered a drug unless you take a supplement in extreme doses and it elicits an effect. The dangerous potential of drug use is that it may become drug dependence. You depend on it. It starts to be the central part of your life and may take over. And we'll talk more about that. Also with drug dependence, you see here long-lasting brain changes. That is normally not a good thing. Okay, so what is a drug? That's a good question because there's not a clear definition. And the definition of a drug has changed over time. It is a chemical substance that, when taken into the body, alters the structure or functioning of the body in some way. Of course, as with vitamins, it excludes those nutrients considered to be related to normal bodily functioning. So there always seems to be an exception in the definition of what a drug is, right? We often define drugs by whether the substance was intended to be used primarily as a way of inducing a bodily or psychological change. So you might define a drug based on what it is used for, what the intended result is. Okay? So the lack of a clear definition results in different terminology, such as drug misuse versus drug abuse. What do you think is the difference there? Well, drug misuse could be a prescription drug that you have legally, but you're not using it according to the doctor's directions. Whereas drug abuse is using something normally that is illegal and using it to extreme and dangerous circumstances. So this last bullet, instrumental use versus recreational use. Instrumental use means a person is taking a drug with a specifically socially approved goal in mind to stay awake longer, perform more quickly, recover from an illness. It's a means to an end that society says is legitimate and normally okay. Legal drugs can be obtained illegally and can be used for instrumental purposes. You may have a friend who has bought some Adderall because they needed to focus for a test. Recreational use means that a person is taking the drug not as a means to a socially approved goal, but for the purposes of experiencing the effect of the drug itself. The motivation is to enjoy a pleasurable feeling or positive state of mind. The consequence of the drug is not a means to an end. It is the end goal. Legal and illicit drugs can be used for instrumental or recreational purposes, though some drugs have little instrumental purpose. Drug misuse applies to cases in which a legal prescription or over-the-counter medication is used inappropriately. An illegal drug may be shared with family members, mixed with other drugs, or used against instructions. Common types of these drugs are antihistamines, anti-anxiety drugs, and sleeping medications. The elderly often take a lot of drugs, and we're just going to keep that in mind as we discuss all the drugs we're going to discuss. Of course, this is an introductory chapter, sort of casting a wide net over all the drugs, and then we're going to zoom in. We're going to focus on the specific drugs and drug possibilities. But as we do so, I want you to always keep in mind that the elderly, old folks, they've got a lot of physical, psychological problems, and normally their doctors put them on 10 or 50 different drugs. And so I don't know if you have any If you've got a grandparent with dementia right now, you probably have to go over to their house and organize all their drugs for them, all their pills, and make sure they don't take the wrong ones, or they're in a nursing home or some living community where somebody has to organize all that stuff. Well, what happens when your grandpa wants to try cocaine again? Well, he's not just mixing it with the caffeine that you may be mixing it with, or the alcohol that you may be mixing it with. Elderly folks, when they abuse drugs, are mixing them with a great potential amount of other chemicals. Remember, every drug is at least one chemical, normally a multitude of chemicals. And if we mix the wrong chemicals together, we have problems, possibly death, right? And so the elderly, keep in mind, are at a specific potential for danger and risk with regard to this. And we should note that the reason physicians are involved in prescribing drugs, among other reasons, is to make sure that chemicals in each of our drugs do not kill us or make us sick when mixed. So, the history of drugs. I'll cover this simply and shortly. Often, substances are accidentally found to have psychoactive effects. In other words, we didn't sit around in a laboratory trying to create cocaine or marijuana. Some guy was like eating a plant and felt really good afterwards and discovered some drug and kept using it, and it became popular. And that's how a lot of drugs are discovered. Or they are developed in a lab for one reason. Wellbutrin, for instance, is an antidepressant developed for that purpose of helping people with depression, but it's used under a different name. It's used all the time to help people quit smoking very effectively. A lot of drugs are used for purposes other than what they were originally intended. What are shamans? That's a picture of a shaman I found. It's colorful. So a shaman is like, a very traditional, very old school. You've probably seen these in movies, um, where they take you on some spiritual journey. I think of Native American Indians. But even before we learned about Native American Indians, and shamans were long before priests even. They were the healers of communities and villages. Um, so what did they do? We'll get into that shortly. The history of drug usage um, involves the accumulation of knowledge about consciousness altering substances. And this would mark the beginning of shamanism. Shamanism is the philosophy and practice of healing in which diagnosis or treatment is based on trance-like states on the part of either the healer, the shaman, or the patient, or both in some cases, right? Later, priests sort of took over. They used drugs to help people and heal people. So the placebo effect is any change in a person's condition after taking a drug, based solely on that person's belief about the drug, rather than on any physical effects of the drug. In other words, I could give you a pill that contains only sugar and tell you that it will make you feel jittery or high. And guess what? You're going to feel jittery or high, even though it's just sugar. That is the placebo effect. It has a lot to do with our expectations for what will happen. By the 19th century, the medical profession was more organized with respect to medicinal healing. Drugs began to be used instrumentally to vaccinate or anesthetize. The market was largely uncontrolled and unmoderated. So there would be advertisements that would sell you heroin for coughs or use cocaine as a topical anesthetic. Almost anyone could sell these drugs legally without any social frowning. The effects of the drugs were not always certain though, right? As you may know, the original formula for Coca-Cola contained cocaine until 1903. Most of what we know about drugs is due to trial and error. For instance, Freud, a famous early psychologist, suggested that cocaine be used to treat morphine addiction until one of his friends became addicted to cocaine. And after that, he was adamantly against it. So I want you to hear that story of Freud. It's an excitement about the drug in the beginning, about the potential. And of course, he didn't know it was horrible. He didn't know of all the harm it could cause. And society has this sort of trend over and over again, excitement about a new drug. And that excitement can lead to very positive effects and a long-term good relationship with the drug. But normally within a year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, we discover, hey, that drug causes cancer. That drug is ruining society. Something about the drug or how it's used is really causing problems. And then, as with Freud, his friend, creating a dependence and having severe problems, we get concerned as a society. And then we turn on the drug. Say, hey, old friend, I used to like you, now I hate you. I'm going to destroy you. And society gets all worked up about it. And so we try to stop the use of that drug. Now, every once in a while, you may have realized, we get excited about fighting a particular drug. But then, like another drug comes about, another drug gets popular, and we decide, oh, enough about drug A, we're going to fight this drug B. We're going to fight this other drug. It's scarier and more important right now. And so we forget about drug A for a while and we fight drug B. And that's very common. And then eventually we'll forget that drug A was bad and we'll be like, man, I want to try drug A again. And then the cycle repeats itself. We start to like it again, we start to use it again as a society. And then we forgot, but we remember how harmful the effects are, and we begin to hate it again. And drugs seem to take, it's like a stage, right? The stage of drugs. Like imagine like a community musical, and every little kid gets their part, like singing a song. Well, drug A had its chance to sing a song. It was good, and we booed them off stage. Drug B took his or her turn on the stage, and man, we threw tomatoes at that little kid. Um, and then drug C, and we keep switching from the drugs that we focus on. And this is largely how our media does things and how our government does things. Recently, as I'm doing this, let's see, there were issues with politics, right? With the foreign policies of Obama, right? But currently, the Republicans have done some things that have taken sort of the heat off of Obama, right? There always seems to be something that the government or media, or maybe they work together, who knows, that shifts our attention as a society from one thing to another. And a lot of this, I believe, is deliberate. And so the best thing you can do is stay informed, focus on what you feel is important, decide for yourself what is important. Don't always trust the media and the government. And do your best to live a healthy lifestyle. Focus on yourself, and if you just don't stay worked up all the time, because there's plenty to be upset about, and you've got better things to do. How drugs work, trial and error. We'll get into that shortly. Most of what we know about drugs is due to trial and error. For instance, Freud suggested that cocaine be used to treat morphine, and then he realized there was some error. Sometimes a drug is developed for one reason, as I said, and later realized to be useful for another purpose. So, Prohibition, the temperance movement. These are two different things, I should mention. Started with the temperance movement, which was sort of a suppressing of drug usage, and led to Prohibition, which was a sort of all-out exile of drugs. You're not allowed to use any. And this specific target was alcohol. So Prohibition, or the American temperance movement, was a religious push, largely religiously oriented, to make alcohol illegal. As a result of Prohibition, people still wanted that alcohol, and they found a way. Eventually, it led to the formation of gangs, underground movements and organizations that helped get you the alcohol you wanted, or get you whatever you wanted. And these organizations that helped to create the supply of alcohol were very disorganized at first, but as they became organized, guess what? They became organized crime units, aka mobs and gangs. So, this is an example of a situation in which something that is bad for us, when regulated, may get worse. Think about marijuana. I'm not going to take an opinion on this or give an opinion on this because I really don't know the answer. But is regulation of marijuana worse? Will it make things worse for marijuana usage? It will probably give the government a lot of money through taxing it. Will it increase use or decrease use? Will people find a way to get the amount that they want and the potency of marijuana they want if it's regulated? Will it increase crime? We also have to consider that right now, it being illegal, a lot of drugs that are illegal, is it worth our time? Is it worth the finances we use for our prison system? And we'll talk about a few of these things. Key drug discoveries included penicillin as an antibiotic, thorazine as an antipsychotic, and cigarettes as sexy and cool. Right? And as I said, they're good. No, wait, they're bad. We hate them. So there's perceptual and societal changes. It's all about perception. While cigarettes and alcohol were considered okay, heroin, marijuana, and cocaine were considered to be wrong. Do they not all have negative effects on the body's health? Societal unrest in the 60s may have increased the use of experimental drugs, partly out of rebellion. Okay, here's some 60s people for you. I think I took that photo from a Woodstock photo. If you don't know what Woodstock is, you should probably look it up. So people began to experiment. They wanted to try sex and drugs and rock and roll, and people began to experiment with LSD, which is acid, as you may know it. They tried stimulants. They tried depressants. So stimulants are referred to as uppers, while depressants are referred to as downers. Heroin was abused a great deal in the 60s as well. The government began to research, probably because they wanted to make money off of it, or because citizens were concerned and they wrote to their senators about it. The government began to research the effects of these drugs. In the 70s, neuroscience. I'd say this is a big deal. You may want to circle this, write it down. Neuroscience was established. And what is it? It's a study. It seeks to understand the relationship between brain functioning and human behavior. It combined those two things. Okay? Pharmacologists, those who specialize in the study of drugs, were joined. They got together with biochemists, psychologists, and psychiatrists in this field of science called neuroscience. Okay? They discovered receptors in the brain tailored specifically for drugs taken into the body. Okay, and this I would say is also important. I've got two important things, and I will try to point these out as I'm talking, as I really realize something I really want you to remember more than other things. Receptors in the brain. We'll talk more about receptors, but I want you to understand that there is a special place in your brain, sort of like the funny bone, right? I can hit you in that special place on your arm and it will cause a certain effect, right? Well, there's a certain place in your brain. Understand there's a lot in your brain that you can't see, obviously, because you've got skin and a skull. But there are these neurons and this vast network of things going on in your brain. And within each neuron are these certain little receptors. Receptors means places to visit, right? Like a hotel, right? There are these hotel rooms that are specifically designed for drugs. Not necessarily for drugs, not necessarily for cocaine, but specifically designed for chemicals, and drugs contain these chemicals. So you need to understand that your brain is hardwired in such a way that it has these rooms, hotel rooms, just waiting to be slept in, so to speak. Receptors, we'll call them. Receptors in each neuron that are matched specifically to these drugs. They will receive these drugs. They will give them a welcome mat. They will say, hey, welcome. I think I know you. Why don't you stay here for a while? And the drugs do exactly that. And they do lots of things to your brain. Once they are accepted or matched to your brain, once they find a place to settle in your brain. Some drugs have an easier time than others to do this. In the 1980s, people began to become more conservative. And I don't just mean always Republican by the word conservative. I meant careful, right? They became careful and concerned about cocaine abuse, right? Cocaine was glamorous and was a symbol of material success, right? People we respected used it. Crack cocaine, a smokable and cheap form, was developed and extended cocaine dependence to the poor and inner cities. Now, a lot of conspiracy theorists will tell you that this was developed by the government to keep the poor, right? Or to keep the African Americans poor. I do not know. I do not have the knowledge of a conspiracy theorist, nor do I want to spend my time doing that. President Reagan and others formed the War on Drugs. Okay, unfortunately, that's Nixon, by the way. Unfortunately, abortion played a larger role in the decrease of drug usage in the 90s. All right, now stay with me. You just heard the devil's word, right? Some of you. may feel that way, and that's perfectly fine. I do not necessarily disagree. That's not my place to teach you about that sort of thing. Not in this class, at least, right? So, how does abortion have to do with drugs? Well, let me give you a quick explanation. And I will tell you this information comes largely from the book Freakonomics. Um, Here's how it explains the association of abortion with the war on drugs. Stay with me. Are you ready? Take 3 deep breaths. 1, 2, 3. Man, I needed that. I've been talking a lot. Okay. Drugs are normally used by unhappy, frustrated, confused, lonely, or angry people. Okay? By the 90s, Roe versus Wade had changed the pattern of abortion behavior. Now, if you're not familiar with Roe v. Wade, it was the legal challenge to the ban on abortion, and the results of it said that abortion, to some extent, was legal. So, after Roe v. Wade became legal, it changed who got abortions. It had changed the pattern of abortion behavior. Many single mothers who were not ready to have a child or did not want the child, even though they were pregnant, they would normally either have to use alternative means such as coat hangers or keep the child. But now they had another choice. Now, whether you agree with this other choice or not is not part of this discussion. I'm not going to talk about that. I know it's very upsetting to a lot of people. I'm not sure that any of us are huge abortion fans. Some of you may be pro-choice for abortion, but none of you are like, get excited about, hey, let's destroy a fetus. I hope that doesn't excite you. Now, many single mothers who were not ready and did not want to have the child they were pregnant with decided to abort the baby when normally they would have kept it. So what happened? Instead of the child growing up in an unhappy home with negative circumstances, the child, of course, did not exist. Thus, a higher percentage of the children that became teens that did exist were happier and more content, had better parental supervision, better homes, and did not abuse drugs in the 90s. Okay? The average of drug taking was not lowered, or in this case increased, by kids who grew up in unhappy homes, kids that were more likely to abuse drugs. Okay? And so it appeared that the war on drugs by the government caused a reduction in drug usage, when in actuality, abortion may have had a lot to do, abortion legalization may have had a lot to do with the decrease in drug usage. Now, if I have upset you by talking about abortion, I'm sorry. Please stay with me. I'm meant to talk about things that sometimes are controversial. I'm not trying to promote abortion or say anything bad about it. Attitudes towards drugs are currently mixed. There is a more acceptable attitude towards marijuana these days, and adolescent marijuana usage is increasing due to perceived lack of harm. We've gained a lot of research on the effects of various drugs, both legal and illegal. Sometimes researchers give anonymous surveys in order to get honest responses. Okay, that's pretty much the only way we get true responses is by not attaching your name to a survey. So some key terms we're going to look at are lifetime prevalence, annual prevalence, past month prevalence, and daily prevalence. Lifetime prevalence is if you've ever used a drug in your life, right? Annual prevalence is determined by whether you have used a drug in the past year. Past month prevalence, you can guess, is whether you've used the drug in the last 30 days, whereas daily prevalence rate is determined by whether you've used the drug daily for the past 30 days. Prevalence rates, and we'll talk about a lot of these. I'll throw in just some stats here every now and then. Prevalence rates among high school seniors were the worst in 1979 and best in 1992. They are currently around 38 to 40%. And what does that mean? Overall, 38 to 40% of high school seniors have used drugs. Trends of usage can change every 5 to 10 years. Marijuana usage decreased in the year 2000, but began to increase again in 2006, up to 2011. In 2011, 1 out of 3 high school seniors had used marijuana that year. With regard to younger kids, they often follow the same trends, sometimes as a result of what their older friends and siblings are doing. 8th to 10th graders. College students report similar trends. There's been a general decline in alcohol use and heavy drinking among teens from 1980 to present, partly due to reduced accessibility. College students are known for drinking at about 64%, and binge drinking about 36% of them. Nicotine remains the drug most frequently used on a daily basis by high school seniors at about 10%. Again, that's a daily prevalence rate. College students are less likely to be smokers, and non-college bound seniors are 3 times more likely to smoke at least half a pack of cigarettes per day. All right, so take that in. I think that's important for us to think about. College students are less likely to be smokers. You guys, those who go to colleges, are less likely to smoke. Does it mean you're smarter? Perhaps. Does it mean you grew up in a better home? Perhaps. Compare you to those who are not college bound, who don't plan on going to college or who did not actually go to college. They are 3 times more likely to smoke at least a half a pack of cigarettes per day. Okay? Perceptions of drugs have a lot to do with whether we try it. How risky is it for the body or for legal purposes? But then again, how fun will it be? Right? In the 90s, drug abuse prevention programs in schools were scaled back or eliminated due to a lack of federal funding, and anti-drug public service messages became less prominent in the media. The likelihood of using a drug is often inversely related to how much disapproval might be experienced, especially among adolescents. What does that mean? That means that if it's not okay with mom and dad or the government, I'll probably do it because I'm a rebel. I drive a motorcycle on the sidewalk and smoke 2 cigarettes at once. And I listen to rock and roll music. Not me specifically, but if I was a rebel, I might do that. That's probably an old stereotype of a rebel that I made up. All right. Let's talk about those 26 years of age and older. About 11% report using an illicit drug in the past year. 8% used marijuana or hashish, which is similar to marijuana, while 4% used a prescription type pain reliever, tranquilizer, stimulant, or sedative. Okay. Common answers for why high schoolers use drugs. When asked, we've asked them, why do you do it? Okay. They say stuff like, I want to have a good time with my friends. I want to experiment or see what it's like. I want to feel good or get high. I want to relax or relieve tension. There's some need to predict the amount of drug use that will occur in the future. This is good for society in trying to figure out what the big problem areas are. What are the risk factors that make it more likely a person might be involved with drugs? What are the protective factors? Now, of course, these are on opposite sides of the fence. It's like offense and defense, right, for a drug. Offense is the risk factors. Defense are the protective factors. What are the protective factors that make it less likely that a person may be involved with drugs? The most reliable set of risk factors consist of psychosocial characteristics that reflect a tendency toward or nonconformity within society. Usually what we consider members of a deviant subculture, like skaters, right? When I was growing up, those who rode skateboards were a deviant subculture. Those guys were probably doing some drugs. And then the gothic kids. These days, the scene kids, the emo kids, I don't really know who it is anymore. You guys know, but I'm too old. And I care a little. All right, so these people in the deviant subculture, I use the word deviant because that's what the book uses. It sounds so evil and bad and mysterious and shadowy, right? But it's a subculture. It's a culture that doesn't align its values with what the cool or the right or the moral thing is to do, what your parents might tell you to do. Okay, these people may attend school irregularly, have poor relationships with their parents, or get into trouble in general. You are 6.25 times more likely to try marijuana if you have friends that have tried or used it. You're more than 6 times more likely to try marijuana if you've got friends that have used it. Please note that the predictions are based, and this is important, predictions are based on possibilities and probabilities rather than cause and effect. Your friends who smoke marijuana are not a cause. Oh, you got a friend who smokes marijuana? Dude, you're going to be smoking in no time. It is not a fact. It is not a sure thing. It is a probability that increases or decreases an association, but it is not an exact cause. Okay? I'm going to take a moment to catch my breath and to tell you something that's important. Of course, we're only on the second bullet, and you may be saying to yourself or me, yelling at the YouTube video, saying, hey Joel, could you move a little faster? I've been on this slide for forever. And this picture is pretty cool, right? That smoke is kind of cool, but can we move faster? My answer is no, man. What I've done is made a few amount of slides, so I don't read to you exactly from the slides. Instead, I talk to you. If we were in class, we'd have more of a discussion, of course. But I want you to realize we're going to stay on slides for a long time. I'm going to talk to you. about each bullet. Sometimes a bullet will last 10 minutes. Sometimes a bullet may only last 10 seconds. But I need you to bear with me, try to stay on the bullet that I'm talking about with me, and please be patient. If you need to pause me, that's up to you. I will never know. Good for you. Go do some drugs, or whatever you need to do. Hopefully they're prescription drugs taken as the doctor recommends, but you get the idea. You can do whatever you want and I will not know. Pause me, yell at me, gripe to your friends about me. It will not hurt my feelings. Okay, back to the slide, only on the second bullet. Protective factors. You're less likely to do drugs if you like going to school. Also, you're less likely to have tried to use marijuana during the past year. By the way, the things that I say, unless I express them as my opinion, they are facts. They are based on research. Normally, a lot of research. So I don't just make this up. It's your choice. You're welcome to look up the research yourself and say, oh, Jill's not lying. But it is not my goal in this course to keep you from using drugs or abusing them or anything like that. I do not have necessarily a message that I want to give you about drugs are bad, okay, right? Instead, my job is to inform you, to give you all the information you need to know so that you will be, as much as you want, an expert on drugs as you exit this class. And, of course, that's life application, and class application, which is so that you can pass the class, so that you can get an A or a B in the class. Okay? Because you may not want to be an expert on drugs. So I'll continue. A commitment to conventionality and a degree of social support from family also decreases drug likelihood. The risk factors and protective factors combine with situations and opportunities to result in the overall likelihood of drug behavior. Drugs seem to have popular periods, as I've said. They fall in and out of favor. Club drugs, originally from raves, are now referred to as recreational psychoactive drugs, used by young people primarily in a social setting. Common examples are MDMA, which is also called ecstasy, GHB, ketamine, Rohypnol, also called roofies, methamphetamine, and LSD. These become even more dangerous when taken with alcohol, and that's something you should put a star next to. Everything's worse with alcohol. In other words, well, at least every drug. Okay, I'm not saying alcohol is the devil. I'm just saying mixing chemicals is dangerous. And the most commonly mixed chemical is alcohol. Now, these drugs may be associated with sexual assault because they are easy to slip into drinks. Recreational use of prescription pain relievers has increased dramatically in recent years. 3.5 million people. Examples include hydrocodone, oxycodone, and oxycontin. I think you've all heard of these. So, non-medical use of prescription stimulant medications. You've heard of Ritalin, you've heard of Adderall, and these are common treatments for ADHD and ADD. It's common for individuals to take these drugs at higher doses than prescribed or combine them with alcohol. They may also be sold or given away to friends. This is very common among college students. How do you think pressure to perform in college by your parents, by society, by your teachers affects drug usage? Do you think it increases? Perhaps. Over-the-counter cough and cold medications are also used. 5% of high school seniors use them in a practice commonly referred to as robo-tripping or skittling. There is also alcohol in these drugs that compounds the effects. History has shown us that humans are attracted to the drug experience and enticed to enter into a totally different state of consciousness. We may wish to feel euphoric, lightheaded, relaxed, or powerful. Drugs are easy and quick pathways to these results. Drugs enable us to retreat from a state of stress and sometimes to feel less or no pain at all. Much of initial drug behavior is based on simple curiosity. Now, this is something you should remember, the word dopamine. Dopamine is a neurochemical that results in our feelings of pleasure and reward. It is probably the most important. It is naturally produced in our body and can be released through natural behaviors like running or having sex. But psychoactive drugs may produce dopamine faster and stronger. Okay? Thank you for bearing with me. I want you to know that as we progress, the chapters will get shorter, more concise. We'll move a little faster. Again, this was an introductory chapter that sort of cast a wide net over all the drugs. The second chapter is also somewhat introductory, but by the third and fourth chapters, we'll begin to zone in, to focus on specific drugs, and I think you'll feel like we're moving a little quicker at that point. But as I said, feel free to take breaks. I will see you in Chapter 2